But first, with Labor leader Anthony Albanese recovering from COVID-19, most of the press pack lost access to the man who wants to run this country. This made 2GB radio host Ray Hadley's interview with Albanese of immense news value. And not just because it was rare access, but the interview was fiery and addressed several key political issues Australians needed to know about.
What visa will you give these people? What visa, Anthony?
We won't give them a visa.
What, you're going to take them straight from the vessel onto another vessel and take them to Nauru, are you?
They will not be allowed to settle in Australia.
But how are you going to achieve that?
They won't be in the same way that the government does. We will have no carbon tax.
Let's just make sure there'll be no carbon tax under any government I'll leave, ever.
There will be no carbon tax ever.
Heated stuff, and it set the news agenda for the rest of the week, with Hadley coming on this network to explain why Albanese's comments about temporary protection visas not being used by the coalition were missing some very important context.
He made the point in that interview that there have been no TPVs issued since 2013. Paul, there's a very good reason for that. No one's come. No one's come because Abbott, Morrison and Jim Molan put together Operation Sovereign Borders. It's got three prongs to it. Turn back the boats when they're safe to do so, temporary protection visas, and of course offshore processing. You take one of the three out, you've got a mess.
And the fallout from Albanese's comments on Hadley's show continued to haunt Labor, with wannabe Home Affairs Minister Kristina Keneally now having to explain her party's border policies and whether Labor was truly committed to Operation Sovereign Borders.
What about temporary protection visas? Is that part of the suite of measures?
Laura, we are quite clear on our position on temporary protection visas, and I went through this the other day with Kieran. I'm happy to go through it with you again. And that is that temporary protection visas are not part of Operation Sovereign Borders. Nobody has gone on a temporary protection visas since Operation Sovereign Borders was introduced, because if people attempt to come by boat, they will not make it. They will be turned back or sent to Nauru. People who go to Nauru are not put on a temporary protection visa. They're not put on an Australian visa. So with respect to Ray Hadley the other day, he was wrong.
Well, Keneally tried to spin it as if Hadley was wrong, but she only proved his point. TPVs have not been needed only because Operation Sovereign Borders has been successful in preventing boats from landing. But what happens if people manage to get through? If it isn't safe to turn back the boats, which is the caveat contained in the border policy. And as Sky News host Laura Jays pointed out in the same interview, wouldn't it be safer to simply leave the current visa process in place as a safety net?
So his point there, Kristina Keneally, is that no TPVs have been issued because no boats have arrived. The other point to be made here is these are delicate operations.
No boats have arrived because they are turned back or you are sent to Nauru.
That's right.
If you attempt to come to Australia by boat, you will not make it.
Well, there are circumstances in if a boat cannot be turned back, if it's been sabotaged, if some of the occupants of the boat end up in the water and they need to be taken aboard an Operation Sovereign Borders vessel. The question is,
they will be
what
taken
happens?
to Nauru.
They will be taken directly to Nauru.
They will be taken to Nauru.
That is not something
they will be taken to Nauru.
Is that something that has directly happened under this government? Usually they're taken ashore to processing and then taken. Yeah, I mean, I think there's just a gap here.
Laura, there is no gap here.
Politicians everywhere, take note. Do not yell at the journalist. It doesn't make you look strong and resolute. You just look frazzled and authoritarian. Stay calm. We are allowed to debate these things. Now, moving on slightly, there was another very interesting aspect of this story. As Ray Hadley pointed out on his own show, Nine, the parent company of 2GB, didn't run any of his Albanese exclusive on the evening news that night.
Jeff says, great interview with Albo the other day. Out of interest, why doesn't Channel 9 feature any of that in their news? I thought it was a very important offering that you put together. Well, I thought it was a bit strange myself because when I did the interview on Tuesday, it was carried by Channel 7 News, Channel 10 News, the ABC and Sky News, but not a mention of it on Channel 9, which, strange enough, owns this radio network. I can only imagine that The news director at Channel 9 was relying upon the creed from the Sydney Morning Herald, always independent.
How strange. Even Nine's main commercial free-to-air rival 7 ran grabs from the interview. But we've checked and it appears Hadley is correct. And it didn't make the cut in Nine's Sydney newsroom bulletin that night. Now, as mentioned above, it was probably the most newsworthy interview of the week, and Nine could have owned the whole thing. Well, we put questions to Nine's publicity team about why this could be the case, but they did not respond before this show's deadline, leaving us only able to speculate as to why Hadley's scoop was ignored by his own company. Well, joining me now to break down the big stories of the week, host of the Kenny Report, Chris Kenny, and lawyer and commentator, Caroline DeRusso. Chris, thank you for joining me here on the desk in person.
Great to be back, Jack.
It. Yeah, well, what do you make of this? Channel 9 almost censoring Ray Hadley.
It's strange, isn't it? Because the interview with Anthony Albanese and, again, as you showed with Christina Keneally, showed that Labor still doesn't understand border protection policy, never has understood it, doesn't understand it now. And the Nine newspapers have always been the same. They've never really grasped this issue. They don't want to grasp it. They want an open borders sort of bleeding heart policy, and they pretend that can be achieved as well as keeping borders safe. So they just want to ignore this and not run the story. It is quite extraordinary. I ran snippets of Ray Hadley's interview with Anthony Albanese on my program at 5 o'clock. It was the issue of the day, the border protection confusion from Labor, but also Ray's deliberate effort to get Anthony Albanese to rule out a carbon tax was also news, given the history of Labor with the carbon tax, and also the fact that Joel Fitzgibbon has quite recently described the safeguards mechanism as an effective carbon tax. So there were two standout newsworthy items out of Ray Hadley's interview that the rest of us all recognised, but his own stablemates just couldn't bear to confront reality.
Very strange. Caroline, what do you make of it? Do you think it's some of that, the professional fighting of journalists? If another journalist gets a scoop, sometimes it can be a bit annoying. Maybe the journalists in the Channel 9 TV newsroom didn't like that they didn't have their own exclusive with Albanese.
I'm not sure, and it's a little bit hard to say, obviously not being a journalist myself, so I don't have that sort of, I suppose, professional jealousy or anything like that in that sort of context. But I do find it really extraordinary because it is such a significant piece, and like you said in your opening, there was not much from Albo last week because he was at home. So you would think that something like that would take a centrepiece of the news, and particularly on the day that it aired. So I did find that quite extraordinary that it wasn't in the Channel 9 piece. And it was also in various places in print. But I suppose it's one of those things that when you do something or you don't do something, whether it's a mission or commission, you can really hang yourself out to dry, so to speak, because you give the game away. I mean, they could have run it as a very short clip and we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah, very interesting. Chris, I want to unpack something that you mentioned as well, is the failure to understand, why Operation Sovereign Borders is so important. And what do you make of the way that Christina Keneally has handled some of the fallout from Albanese's comments, the way that she looked so stressed in that interview with Laura?
Look, she doesn't get it. She's always belonged to this Labor for Refugees, Open Borders. That's her background. So does Anthony Albanese. They've always opposed offshore processing and strong borders, and they're pretending to embrace them for the election. So they get found out. Their sop to that left of the Labor Party is to scrap temporary protection visas, and their excuse is they're not required anymore because we're intercepting all the boats. What they don't understand, I must admit, I think Ray Hadley didn't get the detail of this right himself. I mean, he got the big picture right, but the detail is that, yes, a lot of people are transferred from boat to Nauru. That's the way it works. But the TPVs take away the great incentive of getting to the Australian mainland. They are a bit of a pull factor if they're not there. Take away the TPVs and there's an added incentive to try something unexpected, to try a different route, to get yourself somehow onto the Australian mainland, and then through our legal system you're virtually guaranteed permanent residency. TPVs take away that incentive, therefore they're a very important fallback or underpinning of the whole Operation Sovereign Borders system.
And it's a very, very crucial difference in the two policies. And good on Laura Jays for focusing in on that in that interview.